All right, great. So everyone, again, welcome. Thanks for coming today on kind of short notice. And this is the second iteration of this talk, which we gave last Wednesday. Not everybody could get in. And so I'm really glad we were able to do it again and people could join on a beautiful day. So really appreciate your coming in on a beautiful day to do this with us. So this is going to be a presentation on northern white cedar, its ecology and biology and uses. And just want to say that we will have several times during the talk when we'll stop and ask for questions and comments. And I want to say I'm just as interested in comments as questions, because there are some of you out there, lots of you out there who know more than I do about northern white cedar. So this is really a sharing of information. Okay, here's the title slide. So northern white cedar, Thuja occidentalis, you heard my words, tree of life, or arborvitae. I want to also thank all of our partners who helped to promote this event before we get started. Vermont Coverts, Forest Parks and Recreation Department, and Urban and Community Forestry, which is a partnership between the Forest Parks and Recreation Department and UVM Extension. So we're going to start by talking about what it looks like, then how it gets around, what it's related to, uses, and ecology. And we'll start, so you'll see this outline throughout, and I'll highlight what we're going to do next. So what it looks like, it's a conical pyramidal shaped tree. They normally grow to about 50 feet high with a diameter of 2 to 3 feet. But in favorable conditions, they can get to be 70 feet tall and up to 6 feet in diameter. So not a huge tree, but they can get quite large in girth. I mean, here's a really large tree with my colleague Bob Zano. This is in the Boundary Waters Canoe area in Minnesota. So it's a slow growing tree with a mean pathological age of about 400 years, which means that's when they typically die in nature, but they can get to be much, much older than that. There have been trees documented to be as old as 1,653 years old. So it can be a very, very long-lived tree in the right conditions. The growth rates vary with habitat and light availability. The best growth is on mesic sites, just sort of regular moisture sites, not very wet, not very dry. But this tree core, so each one of those lines represents a growth ring. This is a tree core that was taken from an old cedar in an old cedar swamp, a mature cedar swamp in Newark, Vermont, a couple of years ago. And you can see on this that there were some good growth years, some faster growth years, and then some very slow growth years, and then maybe a release and some faster growing years again. So this represents quite a variability in growth rate, even within a single site, depending upon light. The leaves are tiny scales growing in 2 ranks on the twigs, so that you have these 2 opposite leaves, which are sort of like boat keels or clamshells. And then you have, another pair of leaves on the top and bottom of the branchlet that are flattened. So that altogether they form these flat sprays that you're familiar with. The bark of northern white cedar is pale brown, stringy, and fibrous in appearance, sometimes shredding. On young trees, the bark is reddish brown to gray, showing thin brown vertical stripes. But as the tree matures, the bark becomes gray with newly exposed bark brownish or reddish brown. The vertical strips separate from the trunk at the ends and are often oriented in a slight spiral around the trunk of the tree, indicating the spiral growth, actually, of the tree. And actually, in this picture, you can see that slightly spiral arrangement of that tree. So how does it get around? Well, this is really cool. It has, like all gymnosperms or cone-bearing trees, it has cones, and it has separate male and female cones, but they're really, really tiny. So here are the male cones in the early summer, and you can see the stamens beginning to develop at the ends, at the tips of the branches. So those are the male cones, and they're like almost microscopic. They're not showing up yet on cedar trees that I have seen, even though other members of this family are showing their cones already. The northern white cedar is not. And then here are the beginnings of the female cones. These will occur on the same tree and even on the same branch, but on separate branchlets. So the sub-branches will be either male or female, but they can be very close to one another. And the cones, as they begin to mature in midsummer, are sort of egg-shaped and 1/3 to a ½ inch long, really tiny cones. And they mature and ripen in late summer. They're pinkish brown when they're immature, and then they turn kind of this beautiful cinnamon brown at maturity. So this picture was actually taken just a couple days ago on from a branch of cedar that I that I happen to have. That's also cedar right behind me. The seeds are winged, and each cone produces several seeds, 6 to 10 seeds per cone, but hundreds, thousands of seeds per tree. And these seeds are about 1/4 inch long, and they're disseminated, so they're winged, and so they're disseminated by the wind. The wind can carry them long distances up to 200 feet away from the parent tree. Cedar, the reproductive age for cedars is actually that they can begin reproducing as early as 6 years old, as young as 6 years old, but they don't really do their best at seed production and reproduction until about 75 years old. So they reportedly bear good seed crops at intervals of 2 to 5 years. And I'd be interested if, when we pause, if anybody has any experience with that. The seeds germinate best, apologize for this fuzzy photo, the seeds germinate best on old rotten logs, and that's where they tend to germinate in cedar swamps. These are stumps, on either stumps or rotten logs. So that's where you'll see cedar seedlings. But they can also germinate on mineral soil. And these are a bunch of seedlings that were germinated on a gravel parking lot in Greensboro last year. This was in July or so. Now, you'll notice I told you all about the morphology of the cedar leaves, but you'll see that the seedlings actually have leaves of a different shape. They're these little awl-shaped or sort of needle-shaped leaves that occur on the seedling, the very new seedlings. But very soon, as the seedlings mature, they begin to develop the more, the kind of leaves that we're used to, the flattened sprays. And in this parking lot, it was really quite incredible. There were hundreds of, if not thousands, of these seedlings in a very small area. These seedlings, sadly, will probably not survive because they really need moisture to continue to grow. And this is going to be a droughty place and not really suitable habitat for cedar to grow. So these are probably not going to survive very long. So now I want to just introduce a couple people. Last fall, the Vermont Land Trust, together with the Vermont Woodlands Association and some foresters up in the northeastern part of the state, and I think Vermont Coverts also put together and hosted a workshop on northern white cedar and northern white cedar silviculture. That is how to grow and maintain northern white cedar. And this woman is Laura Kenefick. She's a researcher with the U.S. Forest Service out of the Penobscot Research Forest in Maine. And she is an expert in northern white cedar ecology and silviculture. And this guy is Jean-Claude Ruel of Laval University in Quebec. And together we learned they are two of the authors on this silvicultural guide for northern white cedar, along with a few other people. And this is the gathering of people that got together in Greensboro, Vermont last fall. And this is in a property that we own, the Vermont Land Trust owns, our Mud Pond property in Greensboro. And this person actually has property, this is Rich Carbonetti, has property that's immediately adjacent to our property. So collectively, we own this very large northern white cedar swamp and manage it. So here's Laura Kenefick doing something that she loves, which is digging around in the peat. And what she's doing here, you can't really see, but what she's doing here is she's digging around to see if the apparent seedlings on the forest floor are connected. And what she found is she dug up about 6 or 7 different small cedar plants here and found that they were all connected underground, which indicated to her that they're not actually seedlings, but they're actually reproducing vegetatively by a method called layering. This is actually a method that is used commonly in horticulture. And so this is an image from some horticultural website showing that if you lay a branch on the ground and hold it close to the ground, and actually if you put soil on top of that, that there will be at the nodes along the branch, new roots will form and new plants will develop in those places. And these plants, each of these plants are called layers, which is a little bit confusing. We usually think of layers as being vertical, like the layers of a cake, but these are sort of horizontal layers. And so this is actually how northern white cedar reproduces most of the time in natural northern white cedar swamps, in wetland sites, because it's very frequent that a northern white cedar branch will fall, get sort of covered up with moss as the moss grows up over it, and then new roots form along the branch. So this is how it gets around mostly. And now I want to just say a few words about phylogeny, or what northern white cedar is related to. And then after this, we'll take a pause for thoughts, questions, comments. But just briefly, this is sort of a boring slide, but just briefly, in New England, we have, within the gymnosperms, the seed-bearing plants that are not flowering plants, we have 2 groups: the Pineales, which includes the Pinaceae, the pine family, fir, larch, spruce, pine, and hemlock, and then the Cuprocales with 2 families, the Cupressaceae, the cypress family, which includes juniper, cedar, and Atlantic white cedar. And then the Taxaceae, the yew family, which includes yew. So this is just a little overview of the taxonomy of gymnosperms in New England. And I want to focus a little bit on the cypress family, the Cupressaceae, because it is one of the most diverse families in the gymnosperms. It's incredibly diverse in life form, in habitat, and in distribution. This family is distributed worldwide, and it ranges from short little things like this creeping juniper, which you'll find planted at gas stations and along road verges and so forth, which is like an inch or 2 high, little tiny short creeping plant, to the majestic redwoods, which are 200, 300 feet tall, if not more. And this is my son, Willie, who was 9 years old when we took this picture in the great redwoods of California. So that's the range of stature of these plants. And within the genus Thuja, or Thuja, most people say Thuja that I know, there are 5 species. There's ours, the northern white cedar, and then in Western United States, Western red cedar. And then in Asia, there's the Korean Thuja, Japanese Thuja, and there's one more that I missed, which is the Sichuan Thuja. I must have deleted that slide. Oh no, there it is. There's the Sichuan Thuja. So there's 3 Asian species, and this Sichuan Thuja is actually quite rare, and it was thought to be extinct in the wild until it was relocated in a very remote area of Sichuan in the late last century, 1990s, I think. And it is now, these trees, this very small grove of these trees are protected and preserved. But it's thought that based on DNA data, it is thought, and actually more than thought, it's known that the genus Thuja originated in Asia, and the 2 species that we have, the eastern white cedar and the western red cedar, moved to the United States, to North America rather, via land bridges such as the Bering Land Bridge and perhaps also a North Atlantic land bridge. It's an interesting story, but I'm not going to get into it too much. But one thing I want to say is that the word cedar was first applied to what some people call the true cedars, which is the genus Cedrus in the pine family. So these are actually in a different family. They're in the pine family rather than the cypress family. And the one that is maybe familiar to many of you by name, if nothing else, is the cedar of Lebanon, Cedrus libani. So the genus Cedrus is a genus that is found in the Mediterranean region in the Himalayas. And that's what some people call the true cedars, and whereas ours are maybe the false cedars. And this was brought up, actually, when we did the webinar last week, this was brought up by someone, and so I thought it'd be great to add this. And the cedar of Lebanon is something that, it's a tree that has medicinal uses, and there were once extensive forests of the cedar of Lebanon, and they're largely gone now. Some of you may have heard of this tree from the Hebrew Bible. There are many references to it in the Bible. And in those references are references to harvesting the tree and lumber from the tree and uses of the tree, uses in building boats, building homes, etc. So one can learn actually from that source, one can learn a lot about how this cedar was used originally. So, and some people assume that, or wonder whether our uses of cedar come from the uses of the genus Cedrus. Let's take a little pause now and ask Caitlin if there are any questions or comments right now.
Why, yes, there are. So Neil had asked, and Jock had actually chimed in to confirm this, but is northern white cedar the same as eastern white cedar? And I guess I would say, Liz, what other common names would folks, such as arborvitae, come across in hearing about this tree?
Great. Yes, eastern white cedar is definitely is a synonym. Yeah. So in some parts of the country, I think in the Midwest, they're more likely to use eastern white cedar. We tend to call it northern white cedar. But yeah, and arborvitae is a common one. Anybody else think of any others? Okay.
Okay. Great. And then Heather was asking, can you put northern white cedar into a fascine?
Into a what?
Into a fascine? I had to Google that one, but maybe Heather, you have a succinct definition for us. If you want to unmute yourself or type it in the chat box.
Go ahead, Heather, unmute.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so I see here, Heather says, like the bundles of willow branches, wattles, used to build up riverbanks.
Ah, thanks, Heather. Nice to have you on. And I don't know of cedar being used in that way. I mean, the fact that it can root at its nodes would suggest that it could definitely be used that way and would be very effective. So I've never heard of it being used that way, but I don't know, let's look into it and see if other people have used it that way.
Great, and Liz, time for a couple more?
Yep.
Okay, great. So Susan asks, I am growing a northern white cedar hedge. Could I bend over the outer branches to do layering and get a thicker hedge, or would it shade itself out?
Yeah, I think you probably could. One thing that's tricky about hedges is it depends upon the variety or the cultivar of cedar that you're using. And some of them don't lend themselves well to flattening and layering. But I would just give it a try. You just need to give it some soil and light. So it might shade itself out, but if you can go out from the main hedge and make sure there's some soil on top of it, hold it down with landscaping, staples, as shown in that diagram, and I bet you can make it work.
Great. And Erica added a comment, the Torah, so in reference to one of your slides, Liz, is the name of the Jewish Hebrew Bible.
Torah, thank you.
Yeah, great. And then Maggie was wondering, what is appropriate spacing for planting northern white cedars? If they are too close, is there an increased risk of any pests or diseases?
I don't know of pests or diseases. This is not my area of expertise. And I've seen cedars planted very, very close together. So yeah, I don't know. I think you'd have to ask someone more in the know, but I've never seen that. I think I'll be talking a little bit about some other problems with planted cedars in just a minute.
Great.
Okay.
And then one more from Susan. And which is the cedar that smells and is used in closets?
Ah, thank you. Yeah, that one is actually most commonly Western red cedar. But I had, after the last presentation of this webinar, I had a note from someone who was there who talked about using northern white or eastern white cedar this way, but he also treated it with cedar oil, and that made a really nice fragrant wall for his office. But normally it's Western red cedar that's used in trunks and that sort of thing.
Great. And just to follow up, Liz, Big Al had suggested to the question about spacing of planting cedars, he suggested 5-foot spacing.
Great, thanks, Al.
Yeah, and then one more question from Bruce, and that is pollination between the male and female cones from insects or wind?
Ah, thank you, Bruce. I didn't say that, it's from wind. Yeah, they're wind pollinated.
Great, thanks, Liz. That brings us up to all the questions.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we're going to move on now and talk a little bit about about uses. See if I can get, which we've just touched on some a little bit, so this can maybe go a little faster. But here is a really funny, well, not funny, but it's a great photo of our state naturalist Charles Johnson. It's interesting because it was taken in 1986, and so it's sort of a vintage photo, but he's pulling out a cedar post from a bog, actually a fen in central Vermont, showing that how rot resistant this post is. This has been in there for at least a century, and you can see at the bottom, it's still perfectly intact. It's rotted a little bit at the interface of water and air, but it's really held up well over time. So cedar posts are very durable and are used for purposes like this when they come in contact with water and soil. Now here's the fall event that I was talking about again, where a bunch of people got together, and this guy is a cedar mill owner, and he and the other people who were there at this event have this group that they call the Cedar Club, and they're all people who are interested in northern white cedar and how it grows. And his interest is from his ownership of a cedar mill, and here he is talking about the different grades of cedar, shakes and shingles. So that's one of the common uses of cedar, but also posts, fences, siding, all kinds of uses for northern white cedar. Also, horticultural uses. We've mentioned there are a number of different cultivars. When I looked, this golden one is a really pretty one. There's these columnar ones. When I looked myself, I found, this is if you Google northern white cedar or arborvitae, this is something that you'll find. And I found about 20 cultivars, but I learned later that there's actually more like 300 cultivars and possibly more. Some of them harder to find. Now, northern white cedar and western red cedar, and this one is actually western red cedar because we can see it's from the Lakota tribe, so it would be the western species, but both species are used, are considered sacred plants by Native American people and are used in ceremony and during times of prayer. They're also used medicinally for a number of purposes, including treating headaches, coughs, pneumonia, colds, fever, rheumatism, sprains, bruises, and sores. And then there's this legend, which might just be legend, which is that the explorer Jacques Cartier in the mid-1500s and his crew came to North America, what is now North America, and met with the Algonquin Indians. Now, and these men had scurvy. They were very sick, and they spent the winter on the shores of the St. Lawrence River. And it was a rough winter for them, and many of them were dying. But as the story goes, the natives gave them a concoction of northern white cedar tea, and that cured their scurvy. Now, someone who was on the call last week said, well, you know, that might have actually been white pine. So it's a little unclear whether it's actually northern white cedar or not. But northern white cedar is is used as an herbal remedy and essential oil. This is for aromatherapy. So this is meant to just be aromatherapy. And I will tell you that thuya, the active ingredient in thuya is thuyone, and it is very, very toxic. So it's definitely not something to be taken internally. It's just really, you need to be, like true with any medicinal herb, you just need to be really careful in your use of it. And this is actually a modern piece of art about Western red cedar, showing that this particular artist, Tamara Phillips, still regards it as a sacred plant. Okay, now wildlife relationships. Northern white cedar is one of the preferred foods of white-tailed deer. And you can see in this picture, the beautiful photo by Susan Morris, you can actually see that the deer are browsing on these elm twigs. They also browse on northern white cedar. In some places where northern white cedar and deer overlap in range, northern white cedar can constitute up to 25% of the deer's diet. It's high, the browse is high in calcium, it's highly nutritious, with a composition of 28% carbohydrates and 14% crude fibers. And stands of northern white cedar also provide white-tailed deer with shelter from wind and deep snow during the winter. And now all that's wonderful for the deer. When there are too many deer, when deer are overabundant, that can cause big challenges with regeneration of northern white cedar in cedar stands, cedar swamps, because the deer can really decimate the seedlings and saplings. Now you've all seen something like this. This is one of these cultivars of northern white cedar where the deer have eaten basically everything up to 5 feet in height, and that's the height of their browse ability. Those bottom branches of those trees are not going to grow back. It doesn't matter what you do, they're not going to grow back because the growing tips have been chewed off. Here's a picture from a neighbor's home in my neighborhood. Then you can see there that outside, away from the house, the deer are very brave to go up and nibble on the cedars, whereas closer to the house they don't. And look at this, they've just completely ignored this little pine. They don't care about the pine, they love the cedar. And here's something that you've probably also seen, growing a cedar hedge around some unsightly utility thing. Well, it happens that the lower 5 feet of this cedar hedge have been completely eaten by deer. And so you can see the 5 foot tall thing that's inside that's supposed to be hidden. Snowshoe hare also eat northern white cedar and can also be a problem with regeneration, and also porcupines. Lots of birds use northern white cedar swamps in upland sites, including the rare boreal chickadee. And standing snags provide habitat for a number of woodpeckers and other birds, including chickadees and nuthatches. Another little pause for questions or comments.
Liz, we have a comment from Al related to your slide with the stake, and that's on the stake, the bottom can't rot. Wood under the water level receives no oxygen and won't rot ever. The wood in the middle of the stake makes the point that cedar in a damp environment is very resistant to rot.
Great, great. Thanks for that clarification, Al. So you're saying, I think what you're saying is that that any wood that's totally in an anoxic environment will not rot. But what's impressive about that particular picture is that the middle part, which is also still rot resistant.
Great.
Right.
So from Fritz, we hear, we see so much / many white cedar posts for sale in Vermont. Obviously they are sold commercially, but are they grown commercially in orchards or just harvested where they grow naturally? And if harvested from a forest, is there an issue of overcutting or at least leaving the land bare when harvested? And Big Al did say right to your summary of what he said before that.
Okay.
So yeah, so question from Fritz.
Yeah, Caitlin, you might be more knowledgeable about this than you are, more knowledgeable about this than I. I think cedar is taken from natural settings, from swamps, and from actually upland cedar sites, which I'll talk about this in a minute, but upland cedar sites, which are often old field sites, might yield quite a bit of cedar posts as well. So Caitlin, could you actually weigh in and tell me what you think about that?
Sure. No, Liz, I agree. Mostly it's from naturally grown cedar swamps and as you mentioned, other areas. And I would say Liz had mentioned the work of Laura, and then I'm forgetting his name, but up in Quebec. But they did produce a silvicultural guide. So these are guides that foresters use to manage species sustainably. And so they created a silvicultural guide for northern white cedar to really fill that gap in knowledge of how to harvest that thoughtfully. And so for anyone who's interested, I'm happy to put the link to that guide in the chat box so that you can read more about it.
That would be great, Caitlin, and that would be great if you could put it in the chat box, and possibly we could also follow up after the talk with that information. So thanks for that. Anything else? Great. I'm going to go on now to habitats, where it grows, and this is the part that's actually the most fun for me, and that's why we're leaving the most time for it, where it grows and what it grows with. So this is the range of northern white cedar, which is really interesting because there's a sort of main part of the range, and we're near the kind of southern part of the main part of the range, and a lot of it is in Quebec and Ontario. There are these little outliers to the north, which I don't understand. I don't know what those are about. I do know that these outliers to the south, these populations are mostly on rocky ridges and cliffs and streams in the southern Appalachians. And these are probably refugia from when during glaciation, the range of northern white cedar was pushed south. And as it migrated back north, these populations remained in fairly restricted places. There's also in southern New England, there's a few little spots, like this spot in northwestern Connecticut and a couple in Massachusetts, this little bit in Nova Scotia. So that's the range. And let me just talk about the habitat a little bit. These are three different sources, one from the 1800s, one from the 1900s, and one from this century. Zadok Thompson, no relation, his Natural History of Vermont says, this tree is found growing only in swamps and along the rocky banks of streams and ponds. It is universally known as in Vermont by the name of white cedar. It was originally very abundant in the northern western parts of the state and still found in many places in considerable quantities. So he's writing at the time of maximum land clearing in Vermont. Again, and then Fernald's Gray's Manual of Botany, 1950 edition, swamps and cool rocky banks, East Quebec to Saskatchewan, which is not correct. And then Gilman's New Flora of Vermont, published just 5 years ago. Calcareous or base-rich soils in a variety of situations, often dominant in lowland swamps, also steep loamy slopes and on dry limestone ledges. Specimens seen from all counties. So just summarizing the habitat in Vermont, as I understand it, and this has been described by other people, that it's in wet places and dry places, but not much in between. It's prominent in 5 different natural communities. Its habitat is mostly calcareous, and I'm citing this paper by Lyndon Fernald in 1919. And it's found on upland mesic sites, but these stands are often post-agricultural old field sites and probably will not persist. And I'm citing a forester named Pete Hanna in 2004. The soils are sensitive, and there's lots of rare species associated with these different natural communities. This is a map of an ecological classification of bedrock in Vermont. And this map was created, if you can see the small print, by our colleague Gus Goodwin and also Dan Farrell of the Nature Conservancy, together with Margie Gale of the Vermont State Geologist. And on this map, you can see that the blue areas are calcareous areas. So in the western part of the state and the eastern part of the state, these are the calcium-rich bedrock areas. And so this is where we go mostly to look for northern white cedar. It's not the only place we'll find it, but it's where it's common. Now, this is an old field site. This is in the Champlain Valley of Vermont, so where there is calcareous bedrock and where there is a seed source for northern white cedar. So there is a northern white cedar swamp very close to this in Moncton. And this, you can see, in this picture, you can see that cedar, it's actually maybe not easy enough to see, but this is a little different in color, and that's eastern red cedar, which is actually a juniper. But they're growing together in this old field. And this is what an old field site is going to look like after a number of years. It's going to be very dark inside, uniform sized trees, and really nothing growing in the understory. And these are not, in Vermont, are not going to persist long term. Whereas in other parts of its range, these old field sites may actually persist for a long time. Well, the natural communities in which northern white cedar occurs naturally this is sort of my favorite, and maybe for a lot of you too. Northern white cedar swamps are just beautiful, beautiful places, magical places where northern white cedars grow. This is one that I mentioned earlier, owned by our colleague Rich Carbonetti, and with a conservation easement held by the Vermont Land Trust. And then here's one also in Greensboro. This is on the property of the Green Mountain Monastery. And with this, I just want to give a little shout out to the program within the use value appraisal program that allows for enrollment of ecologically sensitive treatment areas. And so this is a group of people who are working together with the nuns of the Green Mountain Monastery, one of whom is right here, that's Sister Ami. And this is her forester, Charlie Hancock, and his assistant. This is Jared Nunnery, the county forester, and that's me, and Eric Sorensen was with us when we were taking the picture. So we were documenting this northern white cedar swamp as a significant area that they will not have to manage, that they'll manage for biodiversity. They won't have to manage it for timber under this program. So in these northern white cedar swamps, here's one of the cool things. This is a Neckera moss. It's not a moss that's restricted to old trees, but it's found most commonly on old trees, and you'll see it in mature northern white cedar swamps. And in these mature swamps, you'll see these downed, rotted logs, and these are great sites for seeds to germinate and seedlings to grow. In northern white cedar swamps, here's a few of the plants. The forest floor is covered with mosses, and stair-step mosses is one that's especially abundant in these swamps. Also, this sphagnum moss, which is recurved sphagnum, Sphagnum squarosum, and then this knight's plume moss. And you can see why it's called knight's plume by the shape of it. Also, some interesting plants. One-sided pyrola, beautiful. Some of these plants are just beautiful, delicate, little tiny plants that are just really fun to see. One-flowered wintergreen, naked mitrewort, water avens, Canada yew. This one's a rare plant called bog wintergreen. And this is another rare plant called marsh valerian. This grows in only 2 places in Vermont. Eric Sorensen and I found this in a cedar swamp in Newark 2 or 3 years ago. And the very rare calypso or fairy slipper. And this one, I'm sad to say, has not been seen in Vermont in more than 20 years. This was probably taken 30 years ago in Barnet, and this plant hasn't been seen in a long time in Vermont. We don't know why. It might be because of deer, it might be because of other herbivores, or it might be climate change. We just don't know, have no idea. But look at this list of rare plants that occurs in those swamps. So another natural community in which northern white cedar is dominant and prominent is northern white cedar seepage forest. These tend to occur on the slopes above. So a northern white cedar swamp is a place that usually has deep peat, up to 16 feet or more of peat. It's a flat surface, saturated surface. But oftentimes if you go outside of the swamp and just start climbing up the slope a little bit outside of a northern white cedar swamp, you'll see this northern white cedar seepage forest, which is on a gentle slope. And you can see the groundwater emerging at the surface and moving through in little rivulets. And there you see the groundwater emerging. And this is a little groundwater sort of seepy area within the seepage forest. And there you can see marsh marigold in bloom. Where I live, it's almost in bloom. Some of the plants occurring in that natural community: pedunculate sedge, seep sedge as we call it, and bog candles. And thanks to Hannah Phillips for this photograph. And also plantain-leaved sedge, which is just beginning to flower right now, in case you're out in the woods seeing it. And there it is in its element in a seepage forest. Red maple northern white cedar swamps are found primarily in the Champlain Valley, and they actually cover thousands of acres in the Otter Creek swamps, the great wetland complex along the Otter Creek that is being protected by the Nature Conservancy, the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, and others. Just an amazing wetland complex along Otter Creek. In Jefferson's, blue spotted salamander are common there, but rare generally. The rare eastern Jacob's ladder occurs there. And look, again, a bunch of rare plants and animals associated with that. And then we have the boreal cedar sphagnum basin swamp, which is a really interesting thing. These are also peat swamps with deep peat, found more commonly in the northern part of the state. We used to originally we were going to call this boreal acidic cedar sphagnum basin swamp, and we took the word acidic out because they're not always necessarily acidic, but they tend to be more on the acid side than on the calcareous side of the pH, rather acid rather than alkaline on the pH range. And in these swamps, we have sheep laurel, mountain holly, and this really cool thing, which is dwarf mistletoe, which is a parasitic plant on black spruce. So black spruce is part of this natural community. You can see the black spruce needles back here. But this plant is growing right in the cambium of the wood. It's just rooted in the wood and is sucking nutrients from the wood. It grows to about 1/3 of an inch tall, and it produces these little tiny seeds that just pop out and land on another twig and grow. These, if you look from a distance at a place where this dwarf mistletoe is growing, you'll see actually witch's brooms that are caused by this growth. And this is a little bit of a techie slide, I apologize, but just want to show you. So when we talk about pH, which is alkalinity or acidity, the mid-range, the absolutely neutral number is 7.0. 7.0. So we can see in typical northern white cedar swamps, the pH range is from about 5.9 to 7.6, whereas in the boreal acidic type, that I just showed you, it's 4.5 to 7.3. So you see 7.3 is actually above the neutral, so they're not necessarily all acidic, but 4.5 is a pretty acidic number. And then just another thing is the muck depth, or peat or muck. The mean in, say, northern white cedar swamps is 1.7 meters. And if you do the math, that's, I don't know, close to 5 or 6 feet, but the range is up to 5.5 meters. So that's much more, 16 or so feet. And the boreal acidic type is tends to be a little bit shallower in range. And then just before we come back to the last natural community in Vermont, I want to show you this really cool thing. This is a geological feature called the Niagara Escarpment, which some of you have heard of, I'm sure, that extends all the way across the Great Lakes to the western side of Lake Michigan. And it is the feature on which Niagara Falls falls over, basically, and there are other falls on it. And it harbors this really amazing ancient forest of northern white cedar. And these forests, these cliff forests, are the oldest forests in the eastern United States. They're hundreds to thousands, more than 1,000 years old, as I mentioned. And so when I mentioned earlier a tree that was 1,600 years old, it's growing here on the Niagara Escarpment. Now in Vermont, we have something very similar. It's not exactly the same, but our limestone bluff cedar pine forest has strong affinities with those cliff communities on the Niagara Escarpment. And ours are growing on the top of bluffs on Lake Champlain, on limestone, dolostone, or even mountain quartzite, different kinds of calcareous rock. And these trees are just clinging to the rocks in the most amazing way. And our colleague Eric Sorensen has aged some trees in this natural community 300 years or older. So we don't have the 1,000-year-old trees, but we have some very old trees on these cliffs and just clinging for dear life onto these cliffs. And they withstand a lot of stress in the winter. This is at Red Rocks Park in Burlington. And this particular spot gets this kind of ice loading every winter as the winds blow and ice forms on the trees, but the trees survive and do just fine. Some of the plants that occur in this natural community: maidenhair spleenwort, broadleaf sedge, blue-stemmed goldenrod, limber honeysuckle, and ebony sedge, and also a number of rare plants, including this ram's head lady slipper. Again, here, a bunch of rare plants and several rare and uncommon animals. And northern white cedar occurs in 14 other natural communities in Vermont, including intermediate fen, and this is the same fen in which that post that Charles was pulling up was from. And I'm going to end right there. And with this slide, I'm going to ask if there are any other comments and questions. And Caitlin, let's take a few questions, and then at about 5 of, let's pause and let Angie speak for a couple minutes. And then if we have more after that, we can continue the conversation.
Great, sounds good, Liz. So Dave was wondering if you'll be getting into how to get cedar to grow with the deer issue.
Yeah. So Dave, I'd love, your perspective on this too, but we foresters and silviculturists, there's a lot of different things we can do, but one of the things that people talk about a lot is just leaving tops in the woods and letting trees fall. Especially if you're just willing to leave a tree in the woods, especially leave the top in the woods, so it can protect the regeneration from deer browse. The other obvious thing is to control the deer herd. The Fish and Wildlife Department is working very hard to promote more hunting and to get more hunters out on the landscape, to promote the idea of landowners inviting hunters onto their land so that we can all be part of the solution of reducing the deer herd in the parts of Vermont, mainly western and eastern parts of Vermont, not the Northeast Kingdom, but the Connecticut River Valley, where deer populations are too high. So I think it's a combination of approaches. Anybody else? Caitlin, do you have anything to add to that?
No, that's great. Dave kind of just chimed back in. I'm around the Tinmouth Channel, and leaving /high does seem to work. That's great. And then for anyone with, arborvitae in a more of a ornamental setting, you can always wrap it in the winter to the browse height to protect those individual trees.
Yeah, and so you saw the photo from my neighborhood. My neighbors actually did protect those over the winter with netting to protect those. Yeah, thanks.
Great. Okay. And Harris was saying, my experience is that cedar grows in very thick, so it can be helpful to thin the stand when they are post size.
Okay, great. And Harris, where are you seeing that thick growth? Are you seeing that as like old field sites or swamp sites or cliff sites? If you want to type that into the chat box, Harris. I think you're right, especially in old field sites. I think it does make a lot of sense. You saw that picture I showed of the interior of an old field site as it matures, and it's very, very thick. So I think that thinning that would make sense.
Yeah, and Harris responded, yes, mostly those old field sites.
Okay, yeah.
Great. And then Susan commented that there's a stand of big old cedars right near the cliff edge of Nichols Ledge and Cabot. It's rocky, dry, and high. Peregrine's nest there. That's cool. And it always seemed kind of magical that these swamp trees were up on the side of the mountain.
Oh, that's great, Susan. Yeah. So I'm familiar with that area. Yeah. And it's an example of, so I'm showing you right here, this is the limestone bluff cedar pine forest. But in the Northeast Kingdom, I have seen that it's the same phenomenon really, but it's inland, it's away from the lake, it's on cliff sites. It's the same thing. It's the trees growing in a place where other trees can't do well is basically what it is. So these trees on the limestone bluff cedar pine forest, kind of nothing else can grow there very well. And the same thing is true on these cliffs like Nichols Ledge. And there's other places in the Northeast Kingdom where that occurs.
Great. Liz, time for one more question?
Let's take one more and then go over to Angie. Thanks.
Okay, great. So this is from Sabina. When peat is harvested for horticultural use, are these the plant communities which are at risk? I've heard that using peat is no longer considered a sustainable choice.
Yeah, most of the peat that we get that's bagged peat is coming from Quebec and some on the coast of Maine. This is harvested not from northern white cedar swamps or our natural communities that I was talking about, but from really large acidic bogs. And these are the way that this works. I've seen it happen is the surface, the vegetation surface is peeled off. The bog is ditched and drained, and then there's this big, huge vacuum harvester that goes over the surface of the peatland and vacuums up about a centimeter at a time. They go year after year, dry it and bag it. And so, you can argue whether that's sustainable or not, but yeah, not really, basically not really, because the rate of peat accumulation is about 1 millimeter per year, and they're harvesting more than that per year in these bogs. Thanks, Sabina, for the question. Let's go over to Angie now.
I just want to take a quick minute to thank both Liz and Caitlin for leading this, but also thank you for everyone who joined. We really look forward to connecting with people. This is like a great learning experience, and we're so excited that you guys are in it with us. This will be recorded. This is being recorded to share afterwards, so I'll definitely be sure to send that link out along with a survey. It's like a 5-minute survey just asking how we did. Check out our website, vlt.org/events, has a great list of other webinars that we'll be hosting. So there's a lot of great content on there. And if you feel so inclined to donate and become a member, I invite you to do that too. And I'm going to turn it back to Liz. If there's any more questions or comments, feel free. And if not, I'll end the meeting, and thank you guys again so much.
Thank you so much, Angie. Let's see if Caitlin has any other questions in the queue.
Yeah, let's see. So we have, this is from Katrin. Can you speak about the relationship or similarity, proximity to red cedar?
I'm really glad you asked that question, because I failed to say that eastern red cedar, Juniperus virginiana, grows in the limestone bluff cedar pine forest right along with the northern white cedar. So they do grow together. I showed you that old field site where they were growing together. So they do grow together. The tendency is for northern white cedar to be in more calcareous habitats, and eastern red cedar, the Juniperus, to be in more acidic habitats. There is a whole natural community that is dominated, that's recognized, it's called red cedar woodland, which grows on acidic bluffs commonly in the Taconic Mountains, and sort of the knobby kind of areas of the Taconic Mountains, and that is dominated by eastern red cedar. That, if you drive around like down Lake St. Catherine and look up on the bluffs there, you'll see the eastern red cedar bluffs. So they do grow together, but there's a tendency for one to be more calcareous and one to be more acidic in its habitat. Thanks, Katrin.
Could you just review some of the traditional medicinal uses of northern white cedar? That's a question from Anna.
Yeah, so let me just go back to my notes on that. So traditional in the sense of Native American uses, it's actually used in smudging ceremonies to attract the good spirits and eliminate negative spirits. But in terms of medicinal, headaches, coughs, pneumonia, colds, fever, rheumatism, sprains, bruises, and sores. So this is, the Algonquins took a decoction of branches for rheumatism. They used a poultice of powdered wood for rashes and skin irritations. The branches were used in a steam bath for fevers, colds, and toothache. They also used an infusion of cones to treat babies with colic. And I didn't mention this, but Vermont once had a thriving cedar oil industry in the Northeast Kingdom. There were a number of stills. A few years ago, one of our friends who was on last week said he found a still in Quebec in the St. Lawrence River Valley, and that one is probably no longer there. So we probably don't have any more cedar oil stills in our area. I'll repeat that the active ingredient in cedar oil is thulione, which is really dreadfully toxic, causes liver damage, kidney damage, and so forth. Even though it has been taken internally, don't do it without, without supervision of a medical professional.
All right, and I think those are all the questions, Liz.
Okay, thank you, Caitlin, for moderating. Thank you, everyone, for showing up on this beautiful day, and it's been really fun hearing your questions and comments. And we'll have follow-up for you from Angela and the rest of us. So again, thank you.